Hi everyone, welcome back. So, today is lecture number 6 and we are going to talk about print media. So, we have been talking a little bit about print media in terms of the role it plays in the structural transformation of the public sphere, in McLuhan's understanding of what print media means, its nature, etc. But today we are also going to talk in depth about what had happened in the Indian context, etc. So, primarily when we look at the historical context, communication earlier referred to the transportation of goods and people, and in colonial India this term was mainly used in revenue and administrative contexts, but with technological changes communication also becomes associated with information exchange, and modern times like the print revolution and digital age define historical periods, how we talk about the technological era, and of course now we are into the AI era as well. Now, when we think about media and what media means, media is also beyond technology. Media is not just technological infrastructure, but also the cultural and social processes. It includes language, it includes history and cultural social practices. Even non-literate forms of communication like the drum beating, certain symbols, they could function as media. As we were discussing McLuhan's understanding of media, it was very clear that he thinks that the medium is the message, which also means that the medium is the most significant characteristic of human communication here. Now, in the Indian context, there was a colonial ban on drums during one of the revolts, which is called the Pabna revolt, because it thought that the beating of the drum itself was a political tool and it was seen as a form of communication, which communicated dissent. So, one way to understand media is primarily to also think about it as beyond technology. In this context, when we think about print media, it refers to communication through printed text such as newspapers, magazines, pamphlets and books, but this print media also reflects the social and cultural processes in which these printed texts are produced. It is central to the formation of public opinion and dissemination of information and is historically tied to questions of political economy, culture and language. So, if there is a strong print culture, it indicates that there has been strong linguistic and reading cultures. So, print media has played a very key role in shaping modern public spheres and democratic participation, as we have already discussed in the previous lectures. So, I will not go into the details of the public sphere again, as we have had 2 lectures already where we have talked about this concept, but let me begin with this idea of print capitalism, which I have fleetingly mentioned earlier, where political thinker Benedict Anderson talks about imagined communities through shared language that print fosters and leads to national identity creation and formation. Readers imagine connection with others that they have never met, and this is very important for nationalism and political mobilization. For instance, when we think about how certain great works like epics of Mahabharata and Ramayana have been written in Hindu culture, you see that the connection that the reading publics feel with these could actually be felt through the written word. It may not foster national identity, but it fosters a kind of social and regional identity or a religious identity. That is why the translation of those epics into television serials creates even more impact when it has to be attached to the sensory impact and looked at in terms of how it impacts the viewers. Now, when we think about print media, there is often a misunderstanding that the introduction of print media replaced older media, but that is not the case. Print does not replace older media like oral forms of communication. Rumors, symbols, oral communication, etc. continue to remain powerful, and the colonial state actually feared both print and other forms of communication. They also feared the uncontrollable oral networks that existed, where these interactions between oral and print media actually intensifies communication. So, instead of replacement of one by the other, we see it as a coexistence. the colonial public sphere in India, and we had a discussion on this, has been composed of these very diverse forms of communication, and oral, written and print communication all coexisted. The colonial rule therefore relied on intermediaries and local knowledge producers to understand indigenous communication practices, which they saw as threatening to this idea of colonial rule. The Indian language press to them represented in a way a threat, which for the Indian language readers, speakers, etc., on the other hand represented a real India versus the English press. Now, when we are thinking about the public sphere, there is also a national popular public sphere which emerges after independence, and where the state tries to align the public sphere with the question of national identity. So, the Indian press becomes a site of political debate and mobilization, where public sphere is linked to questions of democracy and citizenship, and uneven access and success is tied to questions of diversity and inequality. So, we had discussed some of these issues in our previous lectures, but today first let us talk about the growth of Hindi print media, primarily through also the works of Sebanti Ninan, who talks about how in the 1990s there was a rapid expansion of Hindi newspapers. It is also the post liberalization of Indian economy era, and here growth is linked to rising literacy and the rural middle class, who also has now had access to education and has started reading more and more. Newspapers reach small towns and rural areas, particularly Ninan talks about the Hindi belt, and certain examples are given, for instance of dailies like Dainik Jagaran, Dainik Bhaskar, which expand aggressively and with great intensity. This is also the period which sees localization of print media. So, while in the era of globalization the expectation was that there would be only homogenization and globalization, there is also localization. So, newspapers adopt multi-edition strategies. For instance, Times of India as an English newspaper would have local editions based on the cities. Local news would interest readership which was located contextually. So, newspapers also understood that while the national news, the global news, they were important to everyone, the regional news also continued to remain important. Now, in this sense, what happens is there is that localization of print media, and there was also a creation of an outsider localization in new regions, which means that in many ways there were outsiders who went into different regions to capture and produce news, because there may have been a lack of or absence of people who were equipped to collect news from the regions. Later on, this gives rise to the idea of citizen journalists, where citizens could become also newsmakers and journalists, because they could bring out issues which otherwise remained outside the ambit of traditional media. Now, in this context, unfortunately, what also happens is that smaller newspapers find it difficult to compete, primarily because of the entry of big newspaper houses, etc., into the market. Now, print media, while has had been often hailed as elite media and promoting ideas of restriction of access, one can see particularly in the 1990s that it also gives rise to consumer culture, where rise of television created a huge demand for news. So, today we are all familiar with what would be called breaking news, and news is refreshed every second, but at one point of time that was not the case, as news would be only given to us at particular points of time through the bulletins. But once the television became a daily household kind of affair, there was a huge demand for news that was created, and the print media also became a part of this lifestyle, where it had to adapt in ways where news became content. So, essentially what we see as infotainment today on the television is also a part of what the print media does in terms of curating content around lifestyle, career, entertainment, etc. There was a shift from political kind of news alone to consumer oriented content, where the print houses and other forms of media as well become tied to advertising and markets. So, today if you open a newspaper and go through it, you will find that in the first page there could be an advertisement of a political party or a business group, and that indicates a kind of nexus, what Noam Chomsky would call, between politics and business, and with the media as a propaganda tool, primarily because there is a transformation of media, and in this context print media. These advertisement houses and advertising groups, they play a huge role in how media earns its revenue, and therefore the funding by external parties, third parties, also leads to a transformation of the nature of the media. So, essentially what has happened is that there has been a transformation of the print media from being an elite to mass medium, where one sees, as we had already talked about, Robin Jeffrey's study suggests a transformation from rare to elite to a mass media. So, mass media, the argument, as often we have discussed, goes, can dilute critical engagement, yet there is also increased access and broader participation. So, these transformations in that sense have been very, very regional as well as national in the Indian context. What has been the impact on the public sphere? It means that localization has expanded, the idea of the public has expanded, and there is further fragmentation of it. Readers gain both local and national awareness. If one thinks about media today, and particularly with digital media, you will actually see that all of us are very much aware of what is happening further away from us, probably in Iran with the war, precisely because of how we get news digitally, through newspapers, through the television, etc. What is happening is that we have more awareness about all kinds of issues, which strengthens civic participation and also leads to more questions of identity formation. However, Neenan argues that this also reduces coverage of broader regional issues because they get weeded out of the news process. For instance, something that may have very significant value at a state level may not make it to a national level headline, and that is also often said about disasters, etc., impacting certain states which may be on the margins. This era of localization of news, as I was suggesting, has also led to the growth of citizen journalism and citizen journalists as well as stringers. Now, they are primarily local reporters who include professionals like teachers, shopkeepers, activists, who has managed to increase participation, but at the same time there remain several constraints. These constraints continue to be marred in social conditions where citizen journalists and stringers also continue to be influenced by caste, class and local power structures. So, what happens is that then there is an issue of credibility and also ethics, primarily because the question then becomes that does one require a specific kind of training to become a journalist, or can anybody and anyone become a journalist? One can see that there is also a proliferation of media houses and media schools where you are trained in a particular way to convey news. So, there are several very high level institutions which train people to become media personnel. Now, in that context, these citizen journalist stringers, they generally localize news and lead to more democratic participation, but at the same time there is also a particular debate in terms of who should be a journalist, how should news be presented, how should news be written, how should news be edited, etc. This debate also takes us to the way in which we can understand the transformations of print media. Not to mention that all of these factors in a way lead to the commercialization of print media, where advertising becomes very central to newspaper growth. Chomsky argues that advertising now is actually one of the largest contributors to newspapers and their revenue, and precisely because of that, the content that is being produced in most forms of media, including in print, have become compromised, because market driven journalism is shaping the content that is being created. So, focus has now shifted to profitability and this question of expanding readership, where the brand building of any newspaper or any other form of media is dependent on targeting youth, new readers and more readers. What one can see is that media which was originally started with the intent of engaging the public in rational critical debate, as Ergen Habermas, Nancy Fraser and others have also argued, then transforms into a commercial agent, where you see that it promotes sensational content and also infotainment in the name of entertainment. What you have is actually a focus on profit, a focus on TRPs, a focus on better money. Now, this ideally indicates that when we are thinking about the role of the print media, we have to talk about democratization, which it has led to, as well as questions of exclusion. For instance, media access expanded, yes, but again remains unequal, because participation requires literacy, resources and confidence. Marginalized groups have often suggested that they feel excluded from mainstream media voices. Again, primarily because, as Chomsky would argue, that with the involvement of capitalist processes of production, media becomes a business. So, if you want to run a newspaper or a media house, you need to have big money. There is investment in that, which means that marginalized voices, they remain outside the model, because they do not have that kind of investment. So, Khabar Lahariya, one of the most well known marginalized media voices, has represented subaltern voices in the Indian context, and they have also been a part of what would be called non-mainstream media. But again, that marginalization often leads to media houses which run on the basis of crowdfunding or funding from other sources, etc. So, this is also an issue which is very peculiar to the way that the print media is understood in how we think about modern society. So, when we think about news and print media, there is a change in the nature of news itself, because news became more diverse, but also less predictable. It is generally argued that there is an urban bias in how local news is covered, and there is limited focus on questions of poverty and agriculture, because there is also an expansion of categories related to religion, food, sports, lifestyle, local events, etc. The page 3 of many newspapers would be an indicative of how the nature of news itself has also changed. So, one can see these transformations into commercial news production. When we think about print media in contemporary India, we have to understand that it still coexists with television and digital media and continues to exercise an influential role in shaping the public sphere. It keeps adapting to market, technology and audience needs, and also remains crucial for democracy and public discourse. What one sees is an evolution, but an evolution that continues to remain in process. Now, I am going to make a few conclusory remarks before we wind up this lecture, which is to sort of put print media in context of how we have been understanding this relationship between media, culture and society. So, print media is deeply embedded in these social, political, economic contexts. While it has evolved from an elite discourse to mass participation, and you see localization of news, there is also commercialization, but it continues to exert a significant influence on the public sphere and democratic engagement. For instance, when we think about government exams and how to clear them, for example, we would be very often asked to read certain newspapers, certain sections, with this idea that the written word which is published in the print and the press holds some significance, some value. So, this idea of how news content that is produced in the newspaper is perceived. It is still perceived as an act of, elitism, act of intelligence when you read the newspaper or when you read a magazine or a journal. There are several magazines dedicated to science, there are several magazines dedicated to current affairs, which people read with the hope of, making their lives better from that point on. So, in one way one can see that print media has changed. There have been several shifts with particularly the process of economic liberalization and then entry of foreign media houses, the growth of the vernacular language press, etc. But it continues to remain embedded in the social, political, cultural context of India, as well as of how new questions are raised about relationships with, business and advertising. Thank you.